All right, so let's get started with Unit 1. We're going to start with Chapter 1 here. As I indicated to you guys in the intro video, you guys will start to get into a rhythm with this. You're going to see that I'm going to go chapter by chapter. I'm going to be using the discussion section of each chapter. So if you need to go onto your own McGraw-Hill Connect textbook, you will just go into the contents and you will go down to discussion. So we are going to start with Unit 1, which is the Introduction to Motor Skills and Abilities. I'm going to start with Chapter 1, the Classification of Motor Skills. So, if we get into the discussion, you're going to see my stuff's highlighted, as I said before, and you guys can follow along and highlight as you go along. If it's not exactly what I highlight, don't stress. You can always come back. You can re-highlight things. You can always go back in the video. So, let's start with the classification of motor skills. But first we need to know what motor skills are. And what it says here is that motor skills are activities or tasks that require voluntary control over movements of the joints and body segments to achieve a goal. So basically it's saying that you need to be able to move your body in a particular way to achieve that particular goal. So a motor skill could vary in obviously gross motor skills or fine motor skills, which we will talk about more later. But either it involves moving big body parts, such as your arms or legs or your torso, and it can be as fine as just moving your fingers just slightly. So maybe the difference between like kicking a soccer ball versus throwing a dart. So then we need to talk about what are the components that go into these motor skills. So first we're going to talk about the study of motor learning. So this is the learning that we need in order to acquire motor skills. It's also the learning we need to enhance the performance of this learned or highly experienced motor skill. So as we improve our learning and as we get more experience with a skill, our expertise or our ability to do that skill generally improves depending on what it is. And then also we talk about the reacquisition of skills that are difficult to perform or cannot be performed because of injury, disease, or any other factors that could influence that. And that's where my job comes in. Like I'm a physiotherapist by trade, and we see this stuff all the time. You see people with injuries or neurological disease, and they require, a little bit of rehab in order to get to the point where they want to get back to learning that motor skill that they're doing again. So then we talk about the study of motor control. So motor control is just the essence of using that mind-body connection or that neuromuscular system. So your brain and your nerves to your muscles and how it activates and coordinates the muscles and the limbs involved in the performance of the motor skill. And then a branch off of that area of study is the study of motor development. So this is kind of just implying how you develop through your lifetime or how you continuously learn that skill. So this can involve things like growth and maturation, right? So, are you building muscle? Are you getting better at performing that skill? Is it looking smoother? Or it can look more at like the human development aspect of, you're a kid, you don't know how to walk, and then as you get older, you master walking. Obviously that's a pretty easy skill to master, and then as you get older it starts to kind of taper off. So there's different ways of kind of looking at motor development that is a branch off of that motor control section. Again, skipping past, we're going to move into what I want you to focus on, which is skills, actions, movements, and the neuromotor processes. So first we need to ask ourselves, what is a skill? Right? So we learned about, what is motor control, right? What's motor learning? What's motor development? What are motor skills? So then it's like, what is a skill? And so we need to determine what that is. So a skill is commonly used word that denotes an activity or task that has a specific purpose or goal to achieve. So the term skill is used to denote some degree of competence or capacity to perform a task. So we look at like certain aspects, and I love golf, so I'm going to use this example, but like a golfer would be a skill sport because it requires you to accomplish a particular task. A neurosurgeon, they need to be able to perform brain surgery. That's a skill, right? You need a degree of accuracy, you need a degree of expertise, a degree of experience in order to perform that correctly. So that's generally how we look at skills, is making sure that you're accomplishing a specific purpose or goal related to it. There are 3 criteria that are typically analyzed to determine a person's skill level. So those 3 criteria involve the extent to which the person can consistently achieve the goal of the task. The second criteria is the extent to which the person can achieve the task under a range of different conditions. And then the third criteria is the skill level in order to determine their degree of efficiency. So again, if we break these 3 criteria down, we're looking at, can you consistently achieve the goal? Can you do that over and over and over? If you're highly skilled, you can do it a lot more often than people who are low skill. If you can do it in a bunch of different conditions, so if you look at golf, can you do it in the wind? Can you do it in the rain? Can you do it in the sun? Right? That's different conditions. Then that implies a bit more skill expertise. And then your degree of efficiency, right? Are you really sloppy, right? Like, I'm sure you guys have probably seen stuff like this, like some people who run, people who are really good, like efficient runners, they look really like tight and they move really nice and it looks really smooth. And then you got people who look really, really sloppy, right? So generally we look at efficiency as like your capacity to do that not only over and over consistently to accomplish the goal, but can you do it smoothly and do it with the least amount of effort possible. Next, we're going to talk about skills and actions. So obviously you guys now know from covering the skill part, a skill is to accomplish a goal. So now we look at this thing and we say, okay, well, what's an action? Well, an action is also something to achieve that particular goal. So for you guys in this course, we're going to be using this term, actions, synonymously and interchangeably with the term motor skills. So if you see action or motor skill or skill and action, it's all the same stuff. Next is the characteristics of skills and actions. So we already know there's a goal to achieve. We talked about that in skills. We know they're performed voluntarily, right? This isn't like your heart beating. Your heart beating it happens involuntarily. It's not like breathing. You breathe involuntarily. That's not a skill. That can be considered, I guess, a movement, but it's involuntary versus you actually physically doing it on your own. And then the third part is that a motor skill requires movements of the joints and the body segments in a particular order or path in order to accomplish the goal of the task. So if you think about throwing, your shoulder, your elbow, your wrist, your hand, they would all have to move in a particular way in order for you to throw that ball where you need it to go. Next, we're going to talk about movements. So the term movements indicates specific patterns of motion among the joints and body segments. So that means the movements are component parts of motor skills. We're going to talk about this later, but basically you use movements of certain parts. Let's say your elbow bends and extends, or flexes and extends if you want to get more technical. And you need to be able to use those movements to accomplish that goal. And let's say if it's throwing and you see something where someone's extending their elbow too quickly, you might break that skill down a little bit more to say, hey, this movement in that skill, such as elbow extension, you're extending it too early. We may get someone to practice that movement over and over in order to reintegrate it back into the skill later. So that would be the movement component. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but this is the neuromotor processes. So this is how your brain and your spinal cord and all the nerves communicate with the muscles in order to accomplish movements, which eventually accomplish these actions or motor skills. So the reason why we are breaking apart these components is because there are different levels of study involved in these. So first of all, we look at these components as different ways of learning, right? Like you guys can just, certain people can just pick up a skill and just start learning it, right? They don't have to worry about going through different learning processes, but the more complex that skill gets, the more we need to start breaking it down. So sometimes, like I said, in throwing, we might say, okay, we need to focus on your elbow movement. And other times we might look at like the brain and the neurological system, and we might be like, how do we have to train that in order to make you more efficient in doing that? So first of all, action, skills, movements, and neuromotor processes represent the order in which motor control and learning are prioritized, thus highlighting what should be emphasized at different stages of learning. So we do this in a very particular order. If you can do the skill, you just do the skill. If you can't do the skill, we have to break it down to movements. If you can't do that, we break it down to the neuromotor processes of your brain and the nerves and how they communicate with your muscles, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The second reason to distinguish these levels of study is that not all people can accomplish the action goal using the same movement pattern or perform the same movement using the same neuromotor process. So we all learn a little bit differently. We all move a little bit differently. We need to use these strategies accordingly so that people can learn as efficiently as possible. And the third reason is that the different measures are used to evaluate what's happening at each level of the study. So you're not going to measure someone's expertise, their skill, the same that you would measure their neuromotor processes, for example. So there's different ways of measuring each component, and we're going to talk about how you do that later on. Next, we're going to talk about classification. So this is kind of like a bit of a bigger area to cover. So I'll try and go through these as simply as possible. And then you guys will end up kind of integrating a little bit of this into your final project. So just be aware as we go through this part here. So this is a one-dimensional motor skill classification system. So all that means is that it's one or the other. It's black or white, right? So you have continuous motor skills or discrete motor skills. You have open motor skills or closed motor skills, right? So like a continuous motor skill would just be like there's an arbitrary beginning and end. So it'd be like walking, right? You can kind of start when you want and you can kind of end whenever you want. Versus a discrete motor skill would be like, you know, like throwing. Like there's a distinct start and end to a throwing motion. Versus like walking, you could just like continuously do that forever and ever, sort of thing. And then that kind of implies, like, again, where that one dimension is. It's either continuous or it's discrete. We also have, you know, the one I talked about at the very beginning here, gross versus fine motor. So your gross motor skills are like bigger muscles. Your fine motor skills are smaller muscles. So you can kind of start distinguishing those two skills apart from each other. And then finally you have open motor skills and closed motor skills. So this is kind of just saying, you know, what's the stability of the environmental context? Like if the environment is really unpredictable, like when you're driving a car, right? Like everything's moving around you, everything's a little bit different. Even if you drove the same path every day, things are a little bit different. The environment's changing. Versus a closed motor skill, like when you're like drinking a cup, if you're sitting at the table at the start of your day drinking some water, that's going to be a closed motor skill because it's a bit more predictable. You're sitting down, the cup's sitting on a table. That doesn't really change depending on what table you're doing that, whether you're sitting at home drinking water or you're sitting in the bar on Friday evening drinking a beer with your buddies. So that's kind of where you can start distinguishing these skills a little bit more. Now, I'll break these down a little bit more, but not too extensively. So we're going to look at gross motor skills versus fine motor skills. Your gross motor skills use big muscles. Your fine motor skills use small muscles. I really don't need to get into too much more detail than that because you can kind of see where this is going. You're just kind of using that single one-dimensional classification system. Remember that. That's the big concept to differentiate between a gross motor skill and a fine motor skill. And that's what is implied here. Next is the specificity of where movements of a skill begin and end. So this was the difference between continuous and discrete. Continuous being walking, because you can kind of start it whenever and you can end it whenever, versus discrete, which is I can start that I have to start this a very particular way and it has to end at a very particular moment, like throwing. So that's again how you can start to kind of use that scale. One dimension, black or white, discrete versus continuous. And then finally, the stability of the environmental context. So we talked about driving a car versus sitting in your house drinking a glass of water. You have to think that about like the surface in question, right? So like what is the environment happening? Like what's going on around me? Is the supporting surface changing? Right? The supporting surface on which the person performs the skill. Is the object involved changing? Or are other people and animals involved in the performance situation? So if there are more features that are changing or more features that are moving, right? Like when you're driving a car, you're consistently moving and things outside are moving, right? There might be other people or animals, right? There might be objects that are, if it's windy, there might be things flying around, right? That would be more of like that kind of like open skill, that open motor skill, versus when things are really stationary, really predictable, right? Like again, sitting around drinking a glass of water, it's like if I sit in this chair and I drink from this cup at this table, that doesn't really change regardless of what chair or table that you're sitting on, right? That was a very closed motor skill, not a lot of environmental context changing. So just remember that when you are going through this content. Moving on. This is what you're going to need to cover in your final project. This is Gentile's two-dimensional taxonomy. And I want you guys to know this because you're going to need to know it for your quiz, and you're also going to need to know it for your final project. So there are 16 components to Gentile's taxonomy of motor skills. There's these action function on the side, and then there's the environmental context on the y-axis. So action function on the x, environmental context on the y, and you guys are going to be seeing that there is a ranking all the way from 1A right down to 4D. So without going through this very extensively, 1A just involves that there's a lot of body stability, so you don't really have to move your body. It's stationary. There's no object to manipulate, so you don't have to actually physically grab something or move something. The actual environment itself is stationary, so you don't have the floor moving, you don't have things moving by you. You're basically standing in a box with nothing going on. And there's no intertrial variability. So there's not variation from rep to rep. It's all the same stuff over and over and over. So like I said, standing alone in a room. There's nothing going on. There's nothing moving around you. Your body is not moving. It's stationary. There's no object to move. So no object manipulation. This is a 1A. Full body stability, no object manipulation, stationary environment, no intertrial variability. As we move through this, you're going to see that like as it gets more complex, there's going to be more object manipulation, which would be like a 1B. So this would be like shooting basketball free throws. Okay, well, I'm just standing in one spot, nothing else going around me. I'm just throwing a ball. So I'm manipulating an object, stationary body, stationary environment. And this can go all the way into 4D, where you're doing body transport. So you're actually physically moving your body. So you're running or walking or cycling or whatever you might be doing. And you have to manipulate an object. So you might be like playing soccer or hockey or something like that, where you're moving and you have to use an object like a stick or manipulate a ball. And the environment is changing. So like in soccer, you got people moving around you. You know, the turf could be changing from place to place. Hopefully it doesn't, but sometimes there's little divots and holes in the ground. That would be 4D, which is the most complex. So lots of intertrial variability. Things in the environment are in motion. You're moving your body and you're manipulating an object. So that would be your 4D component. So Gentile originally proposed this taxonomy because it actually helped with rehab, which is, again, what I do for a living. So, you know, you do this skill, so you start at like a 1A skill, and then if the person can do that, then you just kind of slowly move through this taxonomy until that person returns to the level that they were at relative to the thing that they want to do. So that could be, you know, playing hockey or soccer or just walking with their dog. You might just kind of use this taxonomy in order to rehab appropriately. So I won't touch on this super intensively, but regulatory conditions, these are the features of the environment that movements must conform to if they're going to achieve the action goal. So like I said, the turf on a soccer field, your body needs to be able to respond to that. Or, you know, it's windy or it's cold, like you need to be able to move a certain way or change the way that you throw that ball because of the actual environmental conditions. So those are regulatory conditions that would affect your action or your skill. Intertrial variability. If I just break down that term itself, so intertrial, so each time you try something, there is variability, so it changes, right? So this just implies that, you know, like playing golf, for example, every shot that you hit, even if you hit and shot from the exact same location, it probably looks a little bit different. Like that ball is not ending up in the exact same spot every time. So there is some intertrial variability, which basically just refers to when the regulatory conditions during the performance are the same or different from one attempt of the performance of a skill to another. Next, we're going to look at non-regulatory conditions. So, other features of the environmental context that can influence how skills are performed, but not as directly as regulatory conditions, are called non-regulatory conditions. So they include features such as the color of an object, the presence of spectators, weather conditions, whether the skill is performed during the day or night. Like those are things that you just don't have control over. They're things that are just existing around that component. Those are non-regulatory conditions versus regulatory conditions, which are features of the environmental context which movements must conform to, right? So, you know, if it's, like I said, the ground itself and it's a little uneven, your movement has to conform to that, right? Now, it says weather conditions, but I would argue like sometimes with wind, that could be a regulatory condition if you have to move a little bit differently in order to compensate for that wind. Like in golf, if you have to try and hit a shot a little bit lower, or in soccer, if you have to try and kick a ball a little bit lower, that's going to be now turned into a regulatory condition versus the fact that if it's just raining, okay, well, it's just wet. Like that's not a regulatory condition. That doesn't really change how you move. It's just going to make it a little bit more difficult. So that would be a non-regulatory condition. Next, the function of an action. So basically, this just relates to the goal, right? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? So like if you're golfing, your job is to try and get the ball in the hole. So, or get it to a certain location so your next shot is a little bit easier to get to the hole. So you know, you're always kind of keeping that in mind when you look at that Gentile's two-dimensional taxonomy is, you know, what's the goal of this action? And then how do I apply that to the person in front of me? Let's say if you are doing rehab. And that basically covers chapter 1. We have, you know, I talked about these 16 skill categories that goes all the way from 1A all the way to 4D. That would be 16 squares. And so basically the idea behind this first lecture is to kind of introduce you guys back into this content and say to you guys, hey, now I have a means of classifying a skill. So whatever skill you pick for your final project, you could already classify that, right? So, you know, I talked about, there's examples that are sitting right in that box there. If you guys pick something, like we had somebody last year that said like, oh, I want to learn guitar, right? I want to learn a song on guitar. I was like, perfect, that's a skill. Then you had to rank it, and then they had to eventually start filling in some of those gaps in their presentation. So definitely refer back to this if you need some more reference points on your presentation for your rubric. And we will move on to chapter 2 in the next lecture.